I've always been drawn to places others avoid. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, where the city meets vast stretches of wilderness, I had plenty of opportunities to satisfy my curiosity for the unknown. But nothing in my years of urban exploration prepared me for what happened last summer when I was 23. I'd recently moved to a small town called River's Edge, about an hour outside Portland, for a job at the local newspaper. The town sits at the base of Mount Carson, and while tourists flock to the official trails during summer days, locals whisper about the old mining paths that snake through the mountain's northern face. They call it the Echo Trail system, named after the way sounds supposedly bounce off the cliff walls in strange ways. My colleague Sarah, a photographer for the paper, shared my passion for exploration. We'd spent several weekends mapping abandoned buildings around town, but the Echo Trail became our obsession after we heard rumors about hikers experiencing inexplicable phenomena there. The stories varied. Some claimed to hear phantom mining equipment, others spoke of music playing from empty caves. Most dismissed these tales as urban legends or the wind playing tricks, but something about them caught our attention. We decided to investigate one Friday night in August. The plan was simple: hike the main Echo Trail around midnight, document anything unusual, and gather material for a potential feature story. Sarah brought her professional camera equipment, and I packed my audio recorder, hoping to capture any strange sounds the area was known for. The trailhead wasn't marked on any official maps, but Sarah had gotten directions from her neighbor, an elderly man who'd worked the mines in the 1960s. We parked my Subaru at an abandoned ranger station around 11:30 p.m., the gravel lot empty except for our vehicle. The summer night was unusually cool, and a thin fog had settled in the valley below. "Maybe we should have waited until morning," Sarah said, adjusting her backpack. Her usual confidence seemed slightly shaken as we stared into the darkness ahead. "Where's your sense of adventure?" I teased, but I understood her hesitation. The forest felt different at night, more alive somehow. The tall pines swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows dancing in the beam of our headlamps. The first mile was uneventful. The trail, though overgrown, was still visible, a narrow dirt path cutting through dense undergrowth. Old mining equipment littered the sides: rusted carts, rotting support beams, cable spools slowly being reclaimed by nature. Sarah stopped occasionally to photograph particularly interesting pieces, the flash of her camera momentarily illuminating the forest like lightning. About an hour in, we reached the first mine entrance. It was smaller than I expected, more of a cave than a proper shaft, with ancient timber supports framing the opening. A cool breeze emanated from within, carrying the musty smell of wet stone and decay. "Let's record here for a bit," I suggested, setting up my audio equipment. Sarah nodded, taking long exposure shots of the entrance. We stood in silence, listening to the forest. The usual night sounds surrounded us: crickets, the rustle of leaves, distant owls. But there was something else, something barely perceptible beneath the natural ambience. I adjusted my headphones, trying to isolate it. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, lowering her camera. I nodded slowly. It was like a vibration more than a sound, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As we listened, it gradually became clearer, a rhythmic pulsing that reminded me of machinery, but softer, almost organic. We followed the sound, moving deeper into the trail system. The path narrowed further, winding between towering rock walls. The fog had grown thicker, and our headlamps created eerie halos in the mist. The humming grew stronger, but its source remained impossible to pinpoint. Then we heard the whistle. It cut through the night like a knife, a clear, piercing note that echoed off the cliff faces. Not the shriek of wind through rocks or the call of a night bird, but a deliberate sound, almost musical. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket. "That's not possible," she muttered. "There's nobody else up here." The whistle came again, longer this time, modulating into what could only be described as a melody. It was beautiful in a haunting way, like a lullaby played in a minor key. The sound seemed to move around us, first coming from the direction we'd been heading, then from behind, then from somewhere above. My audio recorder was picking up everything, its levels dancing in the dark. Sarah's camera clicked rapidly as she tried to capture something, anything, in the fog. The melody continued, growing more complex, interweaving with the mysterious hum we'd been following. We should have turned back then. Every instinct was screaming at us to return to the car. But curiosity overcame fear, and we pressed forward, following the music deeper into the mountain. The trail opened into a small clearing, presumably an old mining camp. The remains of stone buildings created dark silhouettes in the fog, and rusted equipment cast strange shadows in our lamplight. The melody was crystal clear here, filling the space like invisible smoke. Sarah's camera flash illuminated something that made us both freeze. In the brief burst of light, we saw movement among the ruins. Not the darting of small animals or the swaying of branches, but something larger, more purposeful. When the flash faded, I could still see them, dark shapes shifting in the mist, always just at the edge of vision. The humming had grown into a drone that vibrated in my chest, and the whistling melody seemed to come from multiple sources now, creating a complex harmony that made my head spin. Sarah's camera flashed again, and in that instant, I saw them clearly. They weren't solid figures, but rather suggestions of form, like smoke given purpose. They moved in time with the music, weaving between the ruins in a slow dance. I counted at least 5 distinct shapes before the darkness returned. "We need to go," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." I nodded, unable to speak. We turned to retrace our steps, but the fog had grown so thick we could barely see the ground. The melody followed us, closer now, and the shapes in the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. We ran. The beam of our headlamps bounced wildly as we stumbled down the trail, the whistling and humming pursuing us like a physical force. Branches whipped at our faces, and loose rocks threatened to send us sprawling. Several times we took wrong turns in the fog, only to hear the melody grow stronger, herding us back to the main path. The shapes kept pace with us, always visible in the corner of my eye but disappearing when I turned to look. The music built to a crescendo, the harmony becoming discordant, almost frenzied. My audio recorder was still running, capturing everything: our panicked breathing, our footfalls on the rocky path, and that impossible melody. We burst out of the fog bank near the ranger station, nearly falling down the final slope. The music cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing and pounding hearts. My car sat where we'd left it, its metal surface gleaming with dew. We didn't speak during the drive back to town. Sarah clutched her camera to her chest, and my audio recorder sat heavy in my pocket. When we finally reached her apartment, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. "We should check the recordings," she said quietly. I wanted to say no, to go home and pretend none of it had happened. But we were journalists, after all. We had to know. The photos showed little at first, just fog-shrouded trees and mining equipment. But in the clearing, Sarah had captured something extraordinary. Faint, luminous forms appeared in several frames, twisted into impossible shapes as they moved through the ruins. They weren't clear enough to make out details, but they were undeniably there. My audio recording was even more chilling. The humming came through clearly, a constant undertone throughout the file. And the whistling, it was perfect, too perfect to be human. The melody was complex and otherworldly, following no musical scale I'd ever heard. Audio analysis later showed frequencies that shouldn't have been possible in nature. We never published the story. How could we? No one would believe us, and we had no way to prove what we'd really encountered. Sarah's photos could be explained away as camera artifacts, and my audio recording, while inexplicable, wasn't conclusive evidence of anything supernatural. We did, however, research the area's history more thoroughly. We discovered that in 1891, 12 miners had disappeared in that section of the mountain. The official report blamed a cave-in, but their bodies were never recovered. More interesting were the accounts from other miners who reported hearing strange music in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Whistling melodies that echoed through the tunnels, accompanied by an odd mechanical hum. I still have the audio file, and Sarah kept the photos. Sometimes, late at night, I'll listen to that recording, trying to make sense of what we experienced. The melody remains as haunting as ever, and if I close my eyes, I can still see those shapes moving through the fog, dancing to their impossible music. I haven't gone back to the Echo Trail, though I've been tempted. Sarah took a job at a newspaper in Seattle shortly after that night, but she emails occasionally. Neither of us has found a rational explanation for what we encountered, and maybe we never will. But one thing's certain, something exists in those old mining trails, something that doesn't belong to our world, and it's still there, whistling its ethereal songs into the darkness. As for me, I still explore abandoned places, but never alone, and never at night. Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unexplored. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through the trees outside my window, I catch myself listening for that familiar melody, hoping I'll never hear it again. Working nights at Mountain View Medical Center wasn't my first choice, but as a recent nursing school graduate, I had to take what I could get. The position was in the laboratory department, processing blood samples and running tests from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The pay was decent, and the schedule, 4 days on, 4 days off, seemed manageable at first. I was wrong about that last part. After 6 months of fighting my natural sleep cycle, I started experiencing the effects of chronic sleep deprivation. Even on my days off, I couldn't seem to reset my internal clock. My girlfriend Sarah kept telling me I should look for day shift positions, but those were hard to come by, and I had bills to pay. The incident happened during my third night back after a break, in late October. I had only managed about 4 hours of broken sleep before my shift, and I was already running on fumes by 3 a.m. The lab was in the basement, tucked away in a corner of the hospital that most people never saw. During the day, it was a bustling hub of activity, but at night, I was usually alone except for the occasional delivery of urgent samples from the ER. That night was particularly quiet. Most of the hospital's elective procedures had been postponed due to a renovation project on the third floor, and the ER had been surprisingly calm. I was catching up on some routine blood work when my pager buzzed, a stat order from the ICU. The hospital's layout was like a maze, especially in the older sections. The quickest way to the ICU was through a service corridor that connected to a back elevator, bypassing the main hallways. I'd taken this route hundreds of times, but something felt different that night. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer than usual, creating pools of shadow between their harsh glare. As I walked, I heard the distinct sound of squeaking wheels behind me. I turned, expecting to see an orderly with a cart, but the corridor was empty. The sound stopped the moment I looked back. Lack of sleep, I told myself. It wouldn't be the first time my exhausted brain had played tricks on me. The elevator was one of those old models with a manual gate you had to pull across. As I reached for it, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a figure in white turning the corner at the far end of the corridor. "Hey," I called out, thinking it might be someone from the night shift looking for the lab. No response. The elevator ride to the ICU was uneventful, but when the doors opened, I immediately knew something was wrong. The ICU should have been staffed with at least 3 nurses, but the station was deserted. The monitors in the rooms were dark, and there was an odd stillness in the air. I checked my pager again. The order had definitely come from ICU bed 12, but as I approached the room, I saw that it was empty, the bed neatly made. Not just unoccupied. It looked like it hadn't been used in days. A soft cough behind me made me jump. I spun around to find an elderly man in a patient gown standing in the doorway. His hospital bracelet caught the light, but something about it looked wrong. The date was from 3 months ago. "I've been waiting for someone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They told me my results would be ready." "Sir, you shouldn't be up here alone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let me help you find your nurse." He smiled, but there was something off about the expression. "Oh, they know where I am. They always know." He took a step forward, and I noticed his feet weren't quite touching the floor. I backed away, my heart pounding. The old man's form seemed to flicker like a bad television signal. His skin became increasingly transparent, and I could see the wall behind him through his chest. That first encounter with Thomas Mitchell was just the beginning. After switching to day shift, I thought I'd left the supernatural aspects of Mountain View behind. I was wrong. It started with small things at first. Lab results printing themselves when no orders had been placed. Blood samples appearing on my desk with labels from patients who died months ago. Then the incidents escalated. One evening, as I was finishing up my shift while the night crew was arriving, all the computers in the lab suddenly displayed the same error message. Patient waiting, time critical. Every screen, even the old printer display, showed the same words. When we tried to clear them, they just reappeared. The IT department couldn't find anything wrong with the system. As soon as the night shift started, everything returned to normal. But that was just the beginning. A week later, I stayed late to complete some backlogged paperwork. The sun had already set, and that familiar nighttime stillness was creeping through the hospital corridors. As I was organizing files, I heard a soft humming sound coming from our cold storage room. It wasn't the usual mechanical hum of the refrigerators. It was a tune, something that sounded like an old hymn. When I opened the storage room door, I found an elderly woman in a nurse's uniform from at least 50 years ago, methodically organizing blood samples. She turned to me with a gentle smile. "These need to be processed right away, dear," she said, holding out a rack of tubes. "We lost too many during the outbreak. We can't let that happen again." Before I could respond, she faded away like mist, leaving behind a single blood tube on the counter. The label was yellow with age, dated 1963. Later research revealed that Mountain View had faced a devastating bacterial outbreak that year. Dozens of patients had died while waiting for blood culture results. The incidents kept multiplying. Night shift workers reported seeing children in old-fashioned hospital gowns playing in the corridors near the lab, vanishing when approached. They always left behind small gifts, origami cranes made from lab requisition forms, drawings of butterflies on specimen labels. One of the new techs, Miguel, discovered that these appearances seemed to cluster around dates when the hospital had faced its greatest challenges: disease outbreaks, natural disasters, mass casualties. It was as if the hospital itself had absorbed the echoes of every crisis, every loss, every moment when time-critical lab results had meant the difference between life and death. The most intense activity centered around the old pneumatic tube system, a network of pipes that once carried samples throughout the hospital. Though mostly sealed off now, security cameras would catch glimpses of phantom tubes racing through the abandoned system at night, carrying messages and samples that had somehow slipped through the cracks of time. I started keeping a journal of the phenomena, cross-referencing them with historical hospital records. A pattern emerged. Every spirit, every ghostly occurrence, was connected to laboratory testing in some way. The children were victims of a meningitis outbreak in the 1950s. The elderly nurse had worked in the lab during the 1963 crisis. Even the phantom tube system seemed to be trying to complete deliveries that had been interrupted decades ago. Thomas Mitchell remained the most active presence. Night shift workers regularly reported encounters with him, always near the ICU, always asking about his results. Some felt only a cold spot and heard his whispered questions. Others saw him clearly, exactly as I had that first night. The hospital administration ignored the stories, attributing them to stress and overwork. But those of us who worked in the lab knew better. We developed our own protocols for handling these supernatural specimens, running the tests, recording the results, even though we knew the patients were long gone. One night, about a year after my first encounter with Mitchell, I received an urgent call from the night shift supervisor, Lisa. She was relatively new and had always been skeptical of the ghost stories. "You need to come in," she said, her voice shaking. "All the analyzers are running samples, but there are no orders in the system. The results, they're all from dead patients." When I arrived, the lab was in chaos. Every piece of equipment was running at full capacity, processing phantom samples. The printers were spewing out results for patients who had died over the past century. In the center of it all stood Thomas Mitchell, more solid than I'd ever seen him. "It's time they all got their answers," he said, gesturing to the shadows gathering around him. I could make out dozens of figures: the children, the elderly nurse, patients in gowns from every era of the hospital's history. Every test matters. Every result counts, even if it comes too late. Then, one by one, the spirits approached the printers, collected their results, and faded away. The children left behind a chain of paper cranes. The elderly nurse straightened a stack of reports before disappearing. Finally, only Thomas Mitchell remained. "Thank you for remembering us," he said, picking up his own results. "For understanding that every sample is a story, every test a life hanging in the balance. After that night, the supernatural activity in the lab diminished but didn't completely cease. We still occasionally find mysterious samples, still hear the phantom tube system late at night. The children's paper cranes appear during particularly busy shifts, like tiny reminders to stay vigilant. I kept my day shift position, but I no longer fear the night shift. The spirits of Mountain View aren't malevolent. They're reminders of our purpose, our responsibility to the patients who depend on our work. We've made changes, too. The lab now has a strict policy about stat orders. They're processed immediately, no matter how busy we are. We've installed better tracking systems and redundant checks. No result is ever delayed, no sample overlooked. Sometimes, on late evenings when the sun is setting and the lab grows quiet, I think I hear Thomas Mitchell's voice echoing faintly. Someone's always waiting. It's not a haunting anymore. It's a reminder that our work matters, that every test could be the one that saves a life. The new night shift techs still tell ghost stories, but they're different now. They talk about helpful spirits who guide them to mislabeled samples, about phantom alerts that prevent mistakes, about paper cranes that appear when they're about to miss something important. I've learned to see these supernatural elements not as disruptions but as part of the hospital's soul, echoes of every life touched by our work, every critical moment when laboratory results made a difference. They remind us that behind every sample is a person, every test a story, every result a life hanging in the balance. Last week, I found a new plaque next to Thomas Mitchell's. It reads, "The Mountain View Laboratory," where every test tells a story and every story matters. Below it, someone had placed a paper crane, perfectly folded from an old lab requisition form. I left it there. Some stories need to be remembered, some waiting needs to be acknowledged, and some ghosts deserve to be heard. If you enjoyed these nightmarish stories, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you want more bone-chilling true stories delivered straight to your feed, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell.